Maybe this is why you never get anywhere. Andrew Mitchell's words stayed in Ethan Mitchell's mind long after the phone call ended. He stood alone at the airport terminal, holding his carry-on bag in one hand and his phone in the other, surrounded by hundreds of strangers moving toward their destinations. But somehow, in that crowded place, Ethan had never felt more alone. His flight had been canceled because of a scheduling issue, and he thought the hardest part would be missing the family trip he had been looking forward to for months. He was wrong. The hardest part was hearing his own family decide that one inconvenience was proof that he was a failure. "We cannot keep waiting around for you," his sister had said earlier. Andrew was right. You always find a way to complicate things. Ethan had tried to explain. He had tried to tell them he was already working on another flight, that he could still meet them later, that he was doing everything he could. But nobody wanted an explanation. They had already made their decision. To them, Ethan was the person who always fell behind. The person who never seemed to have everything figured out. The person they quietly compared to Andrew every chance they got. Ethan looked down at his phone and saw the last message from Andrew. "Maybe this is why you never get anywhere." For a few seconds, he simply stared at the words. Not because they were surprising, but because a part of him realized he had spent years trying to prove that sentence wrong. Ethan Mitchell was 35 years old, and for most of his life, he had been the person who stayed in the background. He was not the brother whose achievements were announced at every family dinner. He was not the person relatives used as an example of success. That role belonged to Andrew. Andrew was 40 years old, confident, successful, and admired by everyone around him. He had the career people talked about, the lifestyle people noticed, and the reputation that made his family proud. Ethan had something different. He had patience. He had loyalty. He had spent years helping people without expecting anyone to notice. But those things were harder to measure. And because they were harder to see, his family often overlooked them. The strange thing was that Ethan never hated Andrew. Growing up, he actually looked up to his older brother. Andrew was the person who encouraged him when they were younger. They shared childhood memories, family traditions, and dreams about the future. But somewhere along the way, their paths changed. Andrew started measuring life through achievements. Ethan started measuring life through the people he could help. Over time, those differences became distance. Standing at the airport that day, Ethan felt something inside him change. He was tired of explaining his worth to people who had already decided what they believed. He was tired of chasing approval from people who only noticed him when he made mistakes. He picked up his bag and walked away from the crowded departure area. For the first time in years, he stopped asking himself how he could prove them wrong. Instead, he asked himself a different question. What would his life look like if he stopped trying to earn a place where he had always belonged? Ethan did not know it yet, but the canceled flight that his family saw as another failure was actually the beginning of a completely different chapter. Because while they were leaving without him, a single phone call was waiting that would change the way everyone saw Ethan Mitchell forever. For most of his life, Ethan Mitchell believed that being dependable was enough. He believed that if he showed up, worked hard, and treated people with respect, eventually they would see his value. But over the years, he learned a painful lesson. Sometimes people only notice what you do when you stop doing it. After leaving the airport that afternoon, Ethan drove back to his apartment instead of searching for another flight. He sat in his parked car for several minutes, looking at the messages from his family. Each one carried the same message in a different way. They did not see him as someone who had bad luck. They saw him as someone who always failed. What they did not know was that Ethan had spent years making choices they never understood. When Ethan and Andrew were younger, everyone assumed Andrew would be the one who carried the family name forward. Andrew was confident from an early age. Teachers praised him. Relatives admired him. He knew how to speak with confidence and make people believe he had everything under control. Ethan was different. He was quieter. He listened more than he spoke. He was the person who noticed when someone needed help before they asked. When their parents faced difficult moments, Ethan was often the one who stepped in without being asked. He helped organize important responsibilities, supported family decisions, and made sure everyone had what they needed. He never saw those moments as sacrifices. To him, that was simply what family members did for each other. But as the years passed, people started comparing the two brothers. Andrew built a successful career and became the person everyone celebrated. Ethan built relationships, solved problems quietly, and created stability that most people never noticed. The difference was that Andrew's accomplishments were visible. Ethan's were not. At family gatherings, conversations often turned toward Andrew's latest achievement. People asked about his work, his plans, and his future. Ethan would smile, listen, and congratulate his brother. He was genuinely happy for Andrew. But sometimes, when nobody was paying attention, he wondered why his own efforts seemed invisible. The truth was that Ethan never wanted to compete with Andrew. He never wanted to prove that he was better. He only wanted his family to understand that success did not always look the same. After returning home from the airport, Ethan opened his laptop and saw an email he had almost forgotten about. It was from a company he had been communicating with for several months. The message was brief, but important. They wanted to schedule a private meeting to discuss a possible partnership. Ethan stared at the email quietly. This was the reason he had planned the trip in the first place. The family vacation had not been his only reason for traveling. He had been preparing for an opportunity that could change his professional future. But he had never told his family because he wanted to wait until everything was certain. He did not want attention. He did not want praise. He simply wanted to do the work and let the results speak for themselves. Ethan closed the laptop and looked around his apartment. For years, he had accepted the role his family gave him. The one who was behind. The one who needed to catch up. The one who was not quite enough. But maybe the problem was never that Ethan had failed. Maybe the problem was that everyone had been looking in the wrong direction. And while his family continued their trip believing Ethan had been left behind, Ethan was about to discover that the unexpected cancellation they laughed about was the moment that opened the door to everything he had quietly built. The next morning, Ethan Mitchell woke up earlier than usual. For the first time in a long time, he did not feel the pressure to explain himself to anyone. He made a cup of coffee, opened his laptop, and reviewed the documents connected to the meeting that had been delayed by his canceled flight. The opportunity in front of him was not something that happened overnight. It was the result of years of patience, learning, and quiet dedication. While his family believed he was falling behind, Ethan had been building something they never knew existed. Several years earlier, Ethan had started developing a solution for a problem he noticed in his industry. He saw businesses struggling with the same challenges, and instead of complaining about it, he began researching ways to create a better approach. He spent evenings studying, improving his skills, and working through ideas after his regular job ended. He never announced his progress because he did not want attention before he had something meaningful to show. That was always Ethan's personality. He preferred results over recognition. But because he stayed quiet, people assumed he had nothing to say. The canceled flight had delayed his plans, but it also gave him unexpected time to reflect. For years, Ethan had allowed other people's opinions to influence how he viewed himself. Every comparison to Andrew, every disappointed look from relatives, and every comment about his choices slowly created a story in his mind. A story that said he was not successful enough. A story that said he was always behind. But now, sitting alone with his laptop and the opportunity in front of him, Ethan began questioning that story. Maybe he was not behind. Maybe he was simply following a different path. Later that afternoon, Ethan received a video call from his mother. He hesitated before answering. Part of him still wanted to avoid another conversation about the trip. But when he answered, he noticed something different. His mother looked uncomfortable. "Ethan, we wanted to check on you," she said. He looked surprised. "I am fine." There was a pause. "Andrew mentioned that you were upset." Ethan looked down for a moment. "I was not upset about missing the flight. I was hurt by what everyone said afterward." His mother became quiet. She had no immediate answer because she knew there was truth in his words. For years, the family had been quick to judge Ethan's choices without asking what was happening behind them. They saw what was missing, but they rarely looked at what was present. After the call ended, Ethan received another message. This time, it was from the company he had been communicating with. They confirmed the meeting would happen the following week. The message included a sentence that made Ethan pause. "We are impressed by your work and believe your approach could create significant value." Ethan read those words carefully, not because he needed someone else's approval, but because they reminded him of something important. The people who truly understood his work never called him a failure. They saw the effort, the creativity, and the determination that his family had overlooked. Meanwhile, Andrew continued enjoying the family trip, unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. He believed Ethan was simply dealing with another disappointment. He had no idea that the brother he considered unsuccessful was preparing for an opportunity that could completely change how everyone viewed him. And Ethan did not know it yet. But the day his family chose to leave him behind would become the day he finally stopped trying to catch up with everyone else. The meeting Ethan Mitchell had been preparing for finally arrived, but it did not happen the way he imagined months earlier. He walked into a modern office building downtown, carrying only a small folder and his laptop. There was no excitement on his face, no desire to prove anyone wrong, and no need to show the world that he had been underestimated. Ethan simply wanted the opportunity to speak for itself. As he entered the conference room, he was greeted by a team of professionals who had spent weeks reviewing his work. They already knew the value of what he had created. They did not see him as the person his family described. They saw him as someone with knowledge, dedication, and a clear vision. During the meeting, Ethan explained his ideas carefully. He answered questions, shared his experience, and described the process that had taken years to develop. He did not exaggerate his achievements. He did not try to impress anyone with confidence or status. He simply explained what he knew and why he believed his approach could make a difference. By the end of the conversation, the atmosphere in the room had changed. The company representatives exchanged looks and smiled. One of them leaned forward and said, "Ethan, we have spoken with many people who have great ideas, but what stands out about you is that you understand the people behind the problem. That perspective is rare." Ethan thanked them, but inside, he felt something more meaningful than excitement. He felt recognized, not because he suddenly became someone different, but because someone finally saw the person he had always been. After the meeting, Ethan walked outside and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The city moved around him, people rushing to their next destination, cars passing through the streets, and conversations happening all around him. A week earlier, he had stood in an airport feeling like he had been left behind. Now he realized that being delayed had given him a moment he never would have taken for himself. He returned home that evening with a quiet confidence he had not felt in years. Meanwhile, Andrew Mitchell and the rest of the family continued their trip. They enjoyed the vacation, shared pictures, and posted memories online. From the outside, everything looked perfect, but small questions had started appearing. Andrew noticed that Ethan was not responding the way he usually did. Normally, Ethan would send messages asking if everyone arrived safely or checking if they needed anything. This time, there was silence. At first, Andrew assumed Ethan was simply being emotional. But as the days passed, he started thinking about their last conversation. He remembered the way Ethan looked after hearing his words. It was not anger. It was disappointment. That difference stayed in Andrew's mind. He had spent years believing Ethan was insecure because he did not have the same type of success. But now he wondered if he had misunderstood his brother completely. A few days later, Ethan received another message from the company. They wanted to move forward with a partnership discussion. The opportunity was becoming real. Ethan looked at the message and thought about the people who had supported him along the way. He thought about the moments when he questioned himself because of other people's opinions. Then he remembered something important. The people who truly understood his value never needed him to prove it. They saw it through his actions. At the same time, Andrew received a message from someone who changed the direction of his thoughts. It was a mutual family friend who had heard about Ethan's meeting. The message was simple. I think you should talk to your brother. You might be surprised by what he has been building. Andrew stared at the screen. For the first time, he felt a sense of uncertainty. Maybe the person he called unsuccessful was not the one who had fallen behind. Maybe he was the one who had failed to see what was right in front of him. Andrew Mitchell could not stop thinking about the message he received. It was only a few sentences, but it changed the way he looked at everything. For years, Andrew believed he understood his younger brother. He believed Ethan was the person who never took risks, the person who lacked ambition, and the person who always needed help. But now, for the first time, Andrew wondered if he had created a story about Ethan without ever taking the time to know the truth. During the family trip, Andrew found himself paying attention to things he had ignored before. He noticed how often conversations about success focused only on visible achievements. He noticed how quickly everyone judged Ethan when something went wrong. The canceled flight had become a perfect example. Nobody asked why Ethan was traveling. Nobody asked what he had planned. They only focused on the inconvenience his absence created. Andrew remembered the phone call clearly. He remembered hearing Ethan calmly explain that his flight had been canceled. He remembered feeling frustrated instead of concerned. Looking back, that bothered him more than the words he had said. He realized he had not even stopped to ask if Ethan was okay. When the family returned home, Andrew decided to visit Ethan. He told himself it was just a conversation, nothing more. But deep down, he knew he needed answers. When he arrived at Ethan's apartment, he noticed something different. There was no sign of someone who had given up. The place was simple but organized. Books filled the shelves. Notes from projects covered part of the desk. It looked like the home of someone focused and determined. Ethan opened the door and seemed surprised to see him. "Andrew, what are you doing here?" Andrew hesitated. For the first time in years, he did not know how to begin a conversation with his own brother. "I wanted to talk," he said. Ethan stepped aside and let him in. They sat in the living room, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Andrew looked around and noticed small details he had never paid attention to before. Ethan had always created a comfortable space, not because he wanted to impress people, but because he cared about the people who visited. "I heard about your meeting," Andrew finally said. Ethan looked at him carefully. "From who?" "A family friend." Andrew paused. "Why did you never tell us?" Ethan looked down for a moment before answering. "Because I wanted to finish something before everyone had an opinion about it." Andrew felt that sentence more deeply than he expected. He realized Ethan had not hidden his work because he lacked confidence. He had hidden it because he knew people would judge it before they understood it. "I owe you an apology," Andrew said quietly. Ethan did not respond immediately. He had waited years to hear those words, but hearing them now did not erase everything that happened. "Do you know what hurt the most?" Ethan asked. Andrew looked at him. "It was not that you thought I was unsuccessful. It was that you never asked." Andrew lowered his eyes. He had no argument because Ethan was right. He had spent years looking at his brother through assumptions instead of curiosity. He had measured Ethan by things that were easy to see and ignored everything that was harder to notice. The patience, the dedication, the effort. "I think I was so focused on being the person everyone admired that I forgot to appreciate the people who supported me," Andrew admitted. Ethan listened quietly. This was not the conversation he expected. He had imagined many times what he would say if Andrew ever realized the truth. But now that moment had arrived. Ethan did not feel the need to prove anything. He simply wanted honesty. "I never wanted to compete with you," Ethan said. "I just wanted to be respected." Andrew nodded slowly. The conversation did not fix everything immediately. Years of misunderstanding could not disappear in one afternoon. But something important changed. Andrew finally stopped seeing Ethan as the brother who was behind. He started seeing him as the brother who had been building something meaningful all along. And soon, the rest of the family would have to face the same truth. The conversation between Ethan Mitchell and Andrew Mitchell stayed on both of their minds long after Andrew left the apartment. For Ethan, it was the first time he felt like his brother had truly listened. For Andrew, it was the first time he realized how much of Ethan's life he had never understood. The next few days were different. Andrew began noticing things that had always been there, but had never caught his attention before. He remembered family gatherings where Ethan was always the first person to arrive and the last person to leave. He remembered how Ethan helped their parents with responsibilities that were never mentioned. During celebrations, he remembered how Ethan always supported everyone else, but rarely talked about himself. The more Andrew thought about it, the more he realized something uncomfortable. He had mistaken silence for weakness. He had mistaken kindness for a lack of ambition. He had mistaken a different path for a lesser one. Meanwhile, Ethan continued preparing for the partnership opportunity. The company had invited him to another meeting, this time with senior leaders who wanted to discuss the future direction of the project. Ethan remained focused, but he also felt something changing inside him. He was no longer working to prove his family wrong. He was working because he believed in what he had created. That difference gave him a confidence he had never experienced before. Before the meeting, Ethan received a call from his mother. He almost ignored it, expecting another conversation filled with explanations and criticism. But when he answered, her voice sounded different. "Ethan, I wanted to say something," she began. He stayed quiet. "I have been thinking about everything that happened. I do not think we gave you enough credit." Those words surprised him. His mother continued, "We always talked about Andrew's achievements because they were easy to see. But we did not ask about your goals. We did not ask what you were building." Ethan looked out the window of his apartment. For years, he had wanted his family to notice him. But now that the moment was finally happening, he realized he needed something more than simple recognition. He needed understanding. "I appreciate you saying that," Ethan replied. "But I hope we can learn to ask questions before making judgments." His mother agreed. Later that week, Andrew invited the family to dinner. This time, it was not a celebration of achievements or a chance to compare lives. It was simply an opportunity to talk. When Ethan arrived, he noticed the atmosphere felt different. Everyone seemed more careful with their words. They asked about his project. They asked how the meeting went. They asked questions they should have asked years ago. Andrew was the first to speak honestly. "I owe Ethan an apology," he said. The room became quiet. Andrew continued, "I spent years believing I was the one moving forward and that Ethan was standing still. I was wrong. He was building something valuable, and I was too focused on my own success to see it." Ethan looked at his brother. It was not easy hearing those words, but it mattered. Not because he needed Andrew to admit defeat, but because he finally felt seen. The conversation continued for hours. Family members shared memories, admitted mistakes, and began understanding each other in a new way. For the first time, Ethan was not the person everyone overlooked. He was simply Ethan, the person who had always been there, the person who had quietly created value without waiting for applause. After dinner, Andrew walked with Ethan outside. "I know I cannot change the past," Andrew said, "but I want to do better moving forward." Ethan nodded. That is all anyone can really do. As they stood together, Ethan realized something important. The canceled flight had not taken something away from him. It had given him a chance to stop chasing approval and start recognizing his own worth. And while his family was finally seeing the truth about him, Ethan had already discovered the most important thing. He had never been a loser. He had simply been surrounded by people who had not taken the time to see him clearly. The days following the family dinner brought a change that Ethan Mitchell never expected. The biggest difference was not in the way people spoke to him, but in the way they listened. For years, Ethan had been surrounded by people who thought they knew his story. Now, they were finally asking questions instead of making assumptions. That simple change meant more than any apology could have. Ethan continued working on the partnership opportunity, and each meeting reminded him why he had stopped seeking approval from others. The company leaders valued his ideas because they understood the effort behind them. They did not judge him by appearances or compare him to someone else. They looked at his experience, his dedication, and the results he had created. One afternoon, Ethan received the official offer he had been waiting for. The partnership would move forward, and his project would become part of a larger plan that could reach thousands of people. He read the message quietly, allowing himself a moment to appreciate everything that had led him there. The most surprising part was that he did not feel the need to immediately tell his family. A few months earlier, he would have wanted to prove that they were wrong. Now, he simply felt grateful that he had never given up on himself. When Andrew heard the news, he was genuinely happy for his brother. It was a feeling he had not allowed himself to have before. In the past, Andrew would have compared the achievement to his own success. He would have looked for differences instead of celebrating the person Ethan had become. But now he saw things differently. He saw his brother's accomplishment as something to be proud of, not something to compete against. "I should have been the first person cheering for you," Andrew told Ethan during a phone call. Ethan smiled slightly. "I think we both spent too much time trying to prove ourselves." Andrew laughed softly. "Maybe you are right." Their relationship was not suddenly perfect. There were still years of misunderstandings between them, but they were no longer avoiding difficult conversations. They were learning how to have them. For Ethan, that was a bigger victory than any professional achievement. Meanwhile, the rest of the family started seeing him differently too. Relatives who once focused only on Andrew's accomplishments began asking Ethan about his work and his plans. They discovered that the person they thought had no direction actually had a clear vision. They learned that success was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, consistent, and built over many years. One weekend, Ethan visited his parents' home for the first time since the airport incident. As he walked through the front door, he noticed how familiar everything felt. The same pictures hung on the walls. The same furniture filled the rooms. But the atmosphere had changed. His family had changed because they finally understood something important. Ethan was never asking to be placed above anyone else. He only wanted to be treated with the same respect they gave everyone else. During dinner, Andrew raised his glass. "I want to say something," he said. Everyone looked at him. "I spent a long time thinking success was about being the person everyone noticed. But I was wrong. Sometimes the most valuable people are the ones who quietly make everything better." Ethan looked at his brother and felt a sense of peace. He knew those words did not erase the past, but they showed that people could learn. They could grow. They could become better versions of themselves. Later that evening, Ethan stepped outside and looked at the sky. He thought about the airport, the canceled flight, and the painful words that started everything. At the time, he believed that moment had taken something away from him. Now he understood the truth. Sometimes life interrupts your plans because it is leading you towards something you were never expecting. And Ethan Mitchell was finally living a life where he no longer needed anyone else to tell him that he mattered. Months passed, and the biggest change in Ethan Mitchell's life was not the success everyone could finally see. It was the peace he felt inside himself. For years, Ethan had carried the weight of other people's opinions. He had allowed comparisons, expectations, and unfair judgments to influence the way he viewed his own life. But now, he understood something he had never fully accepted before. His value had never depended on whether other people recognized it. The partnership continued to grow, and Ethan became busier than ever. His work reached more people, and opportunities that once seemed impossible started becoming part of his everyday reality. But despite the changes around him, Ethan remained the same person. He still answered calls from friends who needed advice. He still made time for his family. He still believed that success meant creating something meaningful, not simply collecting achievements. Andrew noticed that more than anyone, the two brothers began spending more time together, rebuilding the relationship they once had as children. They talked about the years they lost, the moments they misunderstood each other, and the things they wished they had done differently. One evening, while sitting together at a local coffee shop, Andrew looked at Ethan and said, "Do you know what bothers me the most?" Ethan looked curious. "What?" Andrew took a moment before answering. I spent so many years thinking I was ahead of you because my life looked successful. But now I realize I was missing the things that actually mattered. Ethan listened quietly. Andrew continued, "You built trust. You built relationships. You built a life where people wanted to be around you. I was so focused on being impressive that I forgot to be present." Ethan appreciated the honesty. He knew Andrew was not trying to make excuses. He was finally understanding the difference between appearance and reality. Their relationship became stronger because they stopped pretending they had never hurt each other. They talked openly about the past and chose to move forward instead of staying trapped in it. The rest of the family experienced that change too. Ethan's parents became more intentional about listening. They asked about his work, his goals, and his thoughts. They stopped comparing him to Andrew because they finally understood that both brothers had different strengths. The family gatherings changed from conversations about achievements into conversations about people. One afternoon, Ethan and Andrew visited the airport where everything had started months earlier. It was not planned as some dramatic moment. They were simply passing by after a meeting and decided to stop for coffee. As they watched travelers move through the terminal, Andrew smiled. "It is strange being here again." Ethan looked around. "Yeah, a lot changed here." Andrew nodded. "I used to think that was the worst day because everything went wrong." Ethan smiled. Maybe it was the day everything finally went right. They both understood the meaning behind those words. The canceled flight had exposed something that had been hidden for years. It showed Ethan who truly supported him. It showed Andrew the mistakes he needed to face. And it showed the entire family that judging someone's life from the outside could lead to missing the most important parts. Later that year, the family gathered for a celebration. This time, nobody was comparing careers or discussing who had achieved more. They simply enjoyed being together. Ethan looked around the room and saw something he had wanted for years. Not approval, not praise, connection. Andrew walked over and handed him a small gift. Inside was a framed photograph of the two brothers when they were children. "I found this at Mom's house," Andrew said. "I thought you should have it." Ethan smiled as he looked at the picture. It reminded him that before misunderstandings, before comparisons, and before distance, they were simply brothers. The journey had changed both of them. Ethan learned to stop chasing acceptance from people who did not understand him. Andrew learned that success was not measured by what others could see. And together, they discovered that sometimes the person a family overlooks is the person who has been holding everything together all along. 1 year after the day that changed everything, Ethan Mitchell stood in his office looking out at the city skyline and thought about how different his life felt. The view outside the window was not the most important thing. The success, the recognition, and the opportunities were meaningful, but they were not the reason Ethan felt grateful. The biggest change was that he finally understood his own worth. For so long, Ethan had allowed other people's opinions to define him. He believed that if his family did not see his efforts, maybe those efforts were not enough. But life had shown him something different. The people who truly understood him never needed an explanation. They saw his character through his actions. They saw the patience, dedication, and kindness that had always been part of who he was. Ethan continued growing professionally, but he never allowed success to change the person he had always been. He still made time for the people he loved. He still listened when others needed support. He still valued the simple moments that had always mattered to him. The difference was that now he no longer looked at those qualities as weaknesses. He understood they were strengths. Andrew Mitchell also changed in ways nobody expected. The person who once measured life through achievements began measuring it through relationships. He became more thoughtful, more patient, and more willing to admit when he was wrong. He often told Ethan that their relationship was one of the most important lessons he had ever learned. "I spent years trying to become someone people respected," Andrew said one evening. "I never realized I needed to become someone people could trust." Ethan smiled because he knew Andrew finally understood what mattered. Their relationship was no longer built on comparison. It was built on honesty. The rest of the family changed as well. They stopped seeing Ethan as the person who needed to catch up. They started seeing him as the person who had always been moving forward in his own way. Family conversations became different. Instead of asking who had achieved more, they asked how everyone was doing. Instead of focusing only on visible success, they started appreciating the effort behind it. Months later, the family gathered at Ethan's home for a quiet weekend dinner. The atmosphere was completely different from the tension that had existed before. There was laughter, storytelling, and genuine connection. Ethan watched Andrew helping prepare the meal and smiled. It was a small moment, but it represented a huge change. The brother who once misunderstood him was now one of the people who understood him best. After dinner, Ethan stepped outside and sat on the porch. Andrew joined him a few minutes later. They looked at the neighborhood lights and enjoyed the peaceful evening. "Do you ever think about that day at the airport?" Andrew asked. Ethan smiled. "Sometimes." Andrew nodded. "I used to think that was the day everything went wrong." Ethan looked ahead. Maybe it was the day we finally saw things clearly. Neither brother needed to say more. They both understood. The canceled flight had not destroyed Ethan's plans. It had redirected them. It had shown him that he did not need to chase approval from people who failed to see his value. It had shown Andrew that assumptions could hide the truth about the people closest to him. And it had shown the entire family that a person's worth cannot be measured by a single mistake, a missed opportunity, or someone else's opinion. Ethan Mitchell was never the failure they believed he was. He was simply someone whose story had not been understood yet. In the end, the greatest change was not that his family finally recognized him. The greatest change was that Ethan no longer needed them to. He knew who he was. He knew what he had built. And surrounded by the people who truly valued him, Ethan finally felt exactly where he belonged.